extremely messed up World War stories that will blow your mind. Not all historical events make it to the headline. Most of the time, some stories are swept aside to make way for the bigger ones. But as we learn more about the past, we begin to see rarely known stories emerging in the spotlight. And when they do, they'll definitely blow your mind. Here are some. Number 1. The cargo cult of Melanesia. Several indigenous islanders of Melanesia in the Pacific believed that the cargo dropped for American soldiers during the World War II were gifts from the god. After the American soldiers left at the end of the World War II, these islanders built ceremonial airstrips and port for God to send the cargo. They began imitating the behaviors of the soldier, thinking that this would cause the soldiers and their cargo to return. Some cult behaviors involved mimicking the day-to-day activities and dress style of the soldiers, such as performing parade ground drills with wooden and salvage rifles. They are later dubbed as cargo cults. Number 2. The US president who escaped cannibalism during World War II. In September 1944, a group of American soldiers was in the midst of a bombing raid on a small island in the Pacific called 𝗔𝗟𝗦𝗢𝗔𝗓. The Japanese were engaged in an intense battle and managed to shoot down several American bombers. The pilot of one of those planes was the former President of the United States, George H.W. Bush. Bush managed to get out of his plane and parachute into the ocean before getting too close to the Japanese island. To his great luck, he was able to board a life raft and was picked up by the US submarine. 8 other bombers made it out of their planes, but exactly what happened to them was unknown until the early 2000s. After the release of the secret files from the war crimes trial in Guam, it was discovered that the men were tortured, beheaded with swords, and in some instances eaten by their Japanese captors. Number 3. The applause of fear. This part of the video will show you how much Stalin is being feared as a dictator in the Soviet Union. In 1937, when Stalin delivered his speech during a conference, no one dared to stop clapping. The clapping just kept on going and going for minutes on minute. Everybody was extremely anxious about being the first person to sit down. They feared becoming one of the many thousands of people that Stalin had sent to the work camps. The applause went on for 11 minutes until the director of a paper factory decided to stop clapping and sit down. The rest of the attendants quickly followed his lead, and that same night, the director of the paper factory was arrested in his home and sent to prison for 10 years. Number 4. The shaved female collaborators in France. In 1940, after the fall of France, many women had a romantic or sexual relationship with the German forces and were believed to have produced 200,000 French babies with German fathers. After the liberation of France from German occupation, these women were punished for collaborating with the German occupiers and had their heads shaved. Though many of the 20,000 cases of accused women only performed professional services for the occupying Germans rather than being engaged in a romantic and sexual relationship with them. Some were young mothers whose husbands were in German prisoner of war camps and who had no means of support, and their only hope of obtaining food for themselves and their children was to accept the job. It was said that the food and entertainment these women had enjoyed as a result of their conduct created jealousy among people, which eventually disguised as moral outrage. Number 5. The motive behind saving the Jews. In 1938, 32 countries met in France to discuss the dark state of the world at the Evian Conference. Among the concerns was what would be done about Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazi regime. Shockingly, only one nation stood up and agreed to welcome refugees with open arms: the Dominican Republic. The country was run by a dictator named Rafael Trujillo, who is known for his open-door policy for the Jews, and he offered a new life to 100,000 refugees and even donated 26 acres of his properties for settlements. However, they would need to agree to do some back-breaking work like clearing the jungle and tilling the poor soil. Only a fraction of those 100,000 ever made it until Nazis banned Jewish immigration just 2 years after Trujillo's offer. By 1942, Sousa's population of 472 included 158 single men and only 38 single women. Refugees settled in Sousa. Bizarre enough, the true history of the plan was revealed. They found out that it was nowhere near an idyllic paradise. Trujillo opened doors to young men in hopes that they would hook up with native women and whiten his nation's people. An eerie parallel to the Nazis' Lebensborn's program. And speaking of the Lebensborn's program, here is number 6. The Nazi Baby Factories. The Nazification program, dubbed as the Lebensborns by Hitler, was officially started in 1936 with the opening of the Lebensborn home, complete with decor and prospective mothers handpicked by Himmler himself in a little village outside Munich. According to the Jewish virtual library, Lebensborn means wellspring of life. It was also the name given to Himmler's selective breeding program to create a perfect Aryan master race, a breeding regime which was designed by the Nazis, which started with the goal of creating a generation to lead a nation of racially pure Nazi citizens. To this effect, a large number of babies were taken into the large mansions and luxurious villas to be brought up as true Aryans. Initially, Nazi soldiers were told to mingle with the local communities of the occupied territories such as Poland. This meant that a large number of Polish women got pregnant with Nazi babies. Mother and children were then transferred to massive facilities to live a luxurious life. This method was slow and took time until the next batch of Aryan babies. So, the Nazis resorted to kidnapping and forcibly taking away most Aryan-looking babies from their parents. Poland claims that around 200,000 Polish babies were kidnapped under the Lebensborn program. As the Nazis expanded their control over parts of Europe, tens of thousands of children who fit their racial ideal were often stolen from their homes and shipped off to Germanize them through the same Lebensborn program. Number 7. It's the Operation Mincemeat. Operation Mincemeat was a successful wartime deception operation in the Second World War to disguise the 1943 Allied invasion of Sicily. It started in 1943 with the untimely death of 𝗙𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪. His body was found in a London warehouse and his official cause of death was self-administered rat poison. His body wasn't buried though. After spending 3 months on ice, he was outfitted with fake IDs, personal items to support a thoroughly made-up backstory, and some top-secret documents. Then he was dumped off the Spanish coast. The plan was to get those fake documents into the hands of the Germans by spies that the Allies knew were operating in Spain. The plan worked. The documents got all the way to Hitler, who moved 90,000 soldiers to Greece based on the information, essentially clearing the way for Allies to take Sicily and move into Italy. It's pretty much like what we normally see in James Bond movies, which perfectly makes sense. Why? Because it was the intelligence officer Ian Fleming's idea, the man who would later gain worldwide fame as the creator of James Bond. Number 8. A man who escaped the angel of death. Life in the concentration camps is just as uncertain as the life on the World War II front lines, and for most, it didn't end up with liberty. This is probably why it took decades for one Auschwitz survivor to tell the tale of why he refused to go to a doctor for 64 years. In 2009, 𝗙𝗪𝗪𝗢𝗪 had a heart attack. When he woke up in the hospital, his doctor asked him if he knew he only had one kidney. He said, "Yes, I know. The last time I saw the other one, it was pulsating in the hand of a man called Joseph Mengele. He was a doctor too." Ganon and his family were sent to Auschwitz in 1944, and that's when Mengele pulled him out of the line and sent him to the camp's hospital. His kidney was removed first without anesthetic or painkillers, and after Mengele stitched him up, he put him back to work. Ganon spent months cleaning up after other operations until Mengele decided to sit him in a tub of freezing water to check his lung function. Then the mad doctor decided he was no longer needed. Mengele sent him to the gas chamber and he lined up with the other condemned prisoners. Luckily, there was only enough room for 200 people. He was the 201st person in line, and his life was spared. Number 9. The British soldier who may have spared Hitler's life. In September 1918, a British soldier, Private Henry Tandy, who was serving near the French village in Markowing, reportedly encountered a wounded German soldier. He could have killed the enemy, but Tandy declined to shoot him, sparing the life of the 29-year-old German soldier. The German soldier nodded in thanks and disappeared. The soldier turned out to be Lance Corporal Adolf Hitler. Though the accuracy of this story is disputed by historians, it can be traced back. However, when British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain traveled to Germany in 1938 to engage Hitler in a last-ditch effort to avoid another war in Europe, he was taken by the Führer to his new country retreat in Bavaria. There, Hitler showed Chamberlain his copy of the Matania painting, commenting, "That's the man who nearly shot me." Though Hitler's special interest in the painting is odd, he is known to have owned it as early as 1937, acquired from Tandy's old regiment. When asked about it, Tandy remembered, "I took aim, but I couldn't shoot a wounded man, so I let him go." Tandy said the German soldier nodded in thanks and disappeared. Number 10. Choosing life or death for Jewish children. Of the dilemmas anyone could experience, deciding whose name to excuse from sure death in the Nazi camp is surely the hardest. This is the case of a teenage Polish girl, Estera Frenkiel, a secretary in the Lodz ghetto who was given certificates to save Jews from death camps. In 1940, Estera and her parents were among the Jews forced by Nazi into a ghetto in a Polish city of Lodz. Germans seldom entered the ghetto, so the Nazis made the Jews to form a Jewish council of elders to deal with the daily administration, which meant they possessed a considerable power over the lives of their fellow Jews, especially the chairman, 𝗪𝗪𝗕𝗦𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗀It also meant that those close to him could live a better life than the majority in the ghetto. In September 1942, Nazis ordered the deportation of all those people unfit to work. However, Ramkowski and those close to him were given the opportunity by the Nazis to save their own offspring. Estera Frenkiel was fortunate since she worked as a junior secretary in Ramkowski's office. She was later given by the Nazi ghetto manager release forms to excuse Jews from execution. So, she had to make a devastating choice, who should live and who should die. And yes, it's only 10. In typing the names, Estera Frenkiel acted purely by instinct and stressed that one's own family is always closer. She had to take care of them all. Out of these 10 certificates, she had first to consider her own relatives. She did confess that she experienced a guilty conscience when she saw the despair of mothers whose children had been deported. Once or twice, she felt she should have saved the most useful people, but these feelings didn't last very long. Ultimately, she was never shaken from the belief that she had done the right thing. Number 11. The suicide mission to destroy the Gothic lines. In World War II, the Germans built a defensive fortress along the summit of the northern regions of the Apennines, known as the Gothic line. Allied planes tried to airbomb the fortress. Artillery blasted it, but they could not crack the Gothic line until the brave soldiers of the 422 Regimental Combat Team pulled off a rather suicidal mission. Some soldiers hiked the mountainous terrain laden with packs and ammunition and silently crawled up the steep, slippery and shale-encrusted slopes at 60-degree incline, 3,000 feet cliff at midnight to stage an ambush on the German emplacement. But during the climb, some men would accidentally lose their grip and fall at 300 feet, and they would not scream or utter any sounds. They just silently plummeted to their death so as not to compromise their position. After getting into the position, the group waited until dawn to launch their attack, and by dawn, the brave soldiers launched the attack on the German defenses and broke the Gothic line in 34 minutes and won the day. Number 12. Hans Munch, the Good Man of Auzwhitz. The conduct of Nazis at Auschwitz is no doubt one of the most horrible chapters in human history. The cruelty perpetuated on a daily routine was so shocking that in 1947 a Polish court convened a special tribunal to mete out justice to 40 former Auschwitz personnel. Of the defendants, only Dr. Hans Munch was acquitted. Anything special to this guy? A lot. The former prisoners testified that Munch had been kind and humane. He gave them food and extended bogus experiment on female prisoners because he knew they would be gassed once the experiment were concluded. One of the most impressive acts he did, Munch refused to participate in the selection process, dictating who live and perish at Auschwitz. In the final days of World War II, his last official act at the concentration camp was to advise an inmate on how to escape and hand him his service revolver. Number 13. The Death Match of 1942, Dynamo Kiev versus the Nazis. The Death Match of 1942 is a name given to the football match played by Kiev in 𝗪𝗔𝗬𝗦𝗢𝗪, Ukraine, which was under the occupation of Nazi Germany. The Kiev City team consists of the bread factory workers who were former professional footballers of Dynamo Kiev and Lokomotiv Kiev and who were forced to work at the factory under Nazi occupation authority and were made to produce bread for German soldiers. One time, all the citizens were rounded up and forced to listen to the German military decree themselves. Major General 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗢𝗪 noted that the population was too great to control, so he made a plan to pacify the people. His idea to stage a football match between German team and the Ukrainian champions Dynamo Kiev, and he had decided to spare their lives while all other citizens of certain public stature were being executed. During this first match, things didn't go as 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪 had planned, and despite not having trained for many months, the Ukrainian players excelled. The Kiev led 1-0 at halftime and received a halftime speech from 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪 telling them they would be executed if they did not lose. Kiev went out to the second half and buoyed by the stadium full of Ukrainians, they went on to win 4-1. Nobody was executed, but the news of this defeat had reached 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪's superiors, so they insisted on a rematch. The Kiev players were banned from training and the rations reduced, and 5 days later they took to the field against a stronger Nazi selected team. Kiev again were threatened with execution, but they paid it no heed and recorded a resounding 6-0 victory. Under extreme pressure, 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪 brought in the professional team from Hungary. As they were Nazi sympathizers, they were brought to Kiev to restore Nazi pride and to put the Kiev team where they belong. This was a malnourished and trained Kiev's team third match in 7 days. Undaunted by what faced them, Kiev won 5 days later. The Kiev players knew that they had to win every match because their life depended on it. Next game was against the unbeaten German team Plockhoff, where the Kiev played in front of a stadium of entirely German soldiers. No Ukrainians were allowed near the stadium that day, and again they were warned before the match. Lose and they would be spared, win and be killed. And again Kiev won. After that, a Gestapo officer informed them that they would be given one more chance to lose, this time against the German team 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪. Kiev knew that it would be their last, so they played the match of their lives and won. After the match, they were rounded up by the Gestapo. Some were tortured, some were executed, some were sent to the concentration camps. Number 14. Japanese Killing Contest. During World War II in Japan, there was a killing contest between two Japanese army officers which took place during the Japanese invasion of China. The contest was between Tosaki Mukai and Toyoshi Noda, a race to see which of them could kill 100 people first using only a sword. The contest was even covered like a sporting event in a Japanese newspaper with regular updates on the score over a series of days. The two officers were later executed on war crime charges for their involvement. Since that time, the historicity of the event has been hotly contested, often by Japanese nationalists. And if you think that horrendous things like this would emanate only from the villainous Axis powers, think again. Watch number 15. Number 15. US soldiers treating dead Japanese soldiers as trophies. US soldiers also treated dead Japanese soldiers as trophies. In the Second World War, the United States and Japan both used propaganda machinery to provoke the soldiers. The US propaganda against the Japanese has grown so effective that the soldiers started believing that the Japanese were nothing but a bunch of mindless savages. US Army recruited soldiers by calling the whole campaign as Japanese hunting, implying that Japanese were animals to be hunted. Some of them started taking Japanese soldiers' body parts as trophies. Many soldiers were seen wearing necklaces made out of Japanese soldiers' teeth. Some soldiers started mailing the skulls and body parts back home as trophies. The phenomenon grew to such an extent that in 1942, the US Army had to issue an order to stop this sort of behavior, but by that time, it was too late. Equally creepy is number 16, the No Man's Land. The trenches of the World War I were filled with unspeakable horrors, and between the trenches was the No Man's Land, a patch of ground teemed with blooded bodies and occasionally served as the site of temporary ceasefires. There are terrifying tales that circulated among men in the trenches, who claimed to have heard cries of dying people at night. According to the story, No Man's Land wasn't abandoned. Instead, it became the home of deserters from all armies who turned their backs on their countrymen and went rogue. They were said to have dug deep underground, lived in tunnels, and would go out at night to scavenge from the corpses. Others claimed that they would feed on the dead, fighting for the best beats. This tale appeared in print in 1920 when British cavalryman Arthur Hume Beeman wrote about German prisoners of war. He claimed to have been seen disappear into the trenches of the so-called wild deserters. The legend was told over and over again, and by 1948, it had a more horrific ending as well. According to Sir 𝗪𝗪𝗧𝗟𝗧𝗪𝗧, there were no post-war governments that knew how to deal with the cowardly but desperate men, so they were just gassed in their tunnels. So, there goes the list of some mind-blowing stories during the World Wars. And if you love this kind of video, interesting facts, history, or pretty much everything that we seldom encounter every day, just subscribe.